I arrived at Oakwood Elementary early that Tuesday morning, eager to make a good impression. The school was an imposing brick structure built sometime in the 1920s, with high ceilings and windows that seemed to watch you from every angle. The hallways were quiet, most teachers not due to arrive for another hour. The principal had emailed me instructions to prepare room 217 for a third-grade class, whose teacher had called in sick with the flu. The janitor who let me in barely spoke, simply pointing me toward the east wing before shuffling away, keys jangling at his hip. I remember thinking it strange how he avoided eye contact, but I was too preoccupied with organizing my lesson plans to give it much thought. Room 217 was at the end of a long corridor, its dark wooden door slightly ajar. When I pushed it open, the hinges creaked in protest, as if the room itself was reluctant to welcome visitors. The classroom was colder than the hallway, noticeably so. I shivered, attributing the chill to an overactive air conditioning system in the older building. Morning light filtered weakly through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the rows of empty desks. I set my bag down on the teacher's desk and began arranging worksheets for the day's lessons. The air felt heavier in there, somehow pressing against my skin like an unwelcome touch. I had just finished writing my name, Miss Peterson, on the chalkboard when I heard it, the sound that would change everything I believed about our world. A giggle, a child's giggle, high-pitched and innocent, coming from the back corner of the room. I froze, chalk still pressed against the board, certain I had imagined it. I was alone, after all. The school was practically empty at this early hour. Then came the sound of small footsteps, pattering quickly across the linoleum floor behind me. The hairs on my arms stood up as a cold current of air brushed past me, carrying the faint scent of something sweet, like candy or bubblegum. My heart hammering against my ribs, I slowly turned around, expecting to see a student who had arrived early, playing a prank perhaps. The classroom was empty, but one of the chairs, third row from the back, was spinning slowly, as if someone had just vacated it. The seat rotated once, twice, 3 times before gradually coming to a stop. My throat constricted as I stared at the motionless chair, trying to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe a draft from the heating vents, an uneven floor causing the chair to move. I approached it cautiously, reaching out to touch the plastic seat. It was ice cold, much colder than the surrounding chairs. As my fingers made contact, I heard the giggle again, this time seeming to come from directly beside me. I jerked my hand away and back toward the door, my professional composure completely abandoned. In that moment, I wanted nothing more than to flee, to leave this room, and never return. But something made me pause at the threshold. A drawing had appeared on the chalkboard beside my name, a crude figure of a smiling child holding what looked like a balloon. I swear on everything I hold dear that the drawing had not been there moments before, when I had written my name. The chalk I had been using was still clutched in my trembling hand. When the first teachers began arriving, I practically ran to the main office, struggling to keep my voice steady, as I asked the secretary if the room might be double booked. The older woman, Mrs. Winters, regarded me with a knowing look that made my skin crawl. She invited me to sit, offering coffee from a pot that had just finished brewing. As I wrapped my cold fingers around the warm mug, she asked which classroom I had been assigned. When I told her room 217, her expression shifted, a mixture of pity and resignation crossing her lined face. In a hushed voice, she told me about Michael Lehman, a third-grade student who had died in that classroom back in 1974. The boy had choked on a piece of candy during indoor recess, while the teacher was momentarily out of the room. By the time help arrived, it was too late. Mrs. Winters explained that over the years, many staff members had reported strange occurrences in room 217, giggles echoing when no children were present, desk chairs moving on their own, and occasionally, drawings appearing on the chalkboard, always the same figure of a child with a balloon. I completed my substitute assignment that day, but in the library, rather than room 217. The principal was apologetic, claiming he had forgotten about the issues with that particular classroom, and would never have assigned me there, had he remembered. The children seemed unaware of the room's history, chattering happily about their absent teacher, and curious about why we were using the library instead. I continued substituting at Oakwood Elementary in the months that followed, becoming something of a regular presence in the school, but I refused any assignment that would place me in room 217 again. Sometimes, walking past that classroom, I would hear the faint sound of laughter from behind the closed door. Once, I thought I glimpsed a small figure through the narrow window, a boy standing by the chalkboard, looking out at me with dark, hollow eyes. But when I blinked, there was nothing there but shadows and empty desks. Do I believe in ghosts now? I cannot say for certain what exists beyond our understanding, but I know what I heard and saw that morning in room 217. I know the chill that still runs through me whenever I hear a child laugh unexpectedly, and I know that somewhere in that old school building, a little boy named Michael is still waiting for someone to play with him, giggling in the early morning silence, forever spinning in his chair, forever drawing his pictures on the chalkboard, forever reminding us that some stories do not end, even after death. I still hear that sound in my dreams, the slow, deliberate squeak of shower faucets turning, metal against metal, in an empty locker room where no one should be. That high-pitched whine that builds to a hiss as water begins to flow. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, certain that someone is taking a shower in my bathroom, only to find the house silent and still. But I know what I saw that night at Roosevelt High. I know because it changed everything. My name is Steve Callahan, and I have been the physical education teacher and basketball coach at Roosevelt High School for 15 years. I love my job, the energy of the kids, the squeak of sneakers on polished hardwood, the satisfying swish of a perfect shot. Basketball has always been my sanctuary, a place where the rules make sense, where effort equals results. That is what I used to believe. Now I understand that there are things in this world that follow no rules we can comprehend. It was a Tuesday in November, just after Thanksgiving break. The varsity team had been struggling with their zone defense, so I had scheduled an extra evening practice. The kids had worked hard, their shirts soaked with sweat by the time I blew the final whistle at 8:30 p.m. I watched them file into the locker room, their voices echoing in the cavernous space. I busied myself putting away equipment while they changed. One by one, they emerged, calling out goodbyes as they headed into the chilly night. By 9 p.m., the last player had left, and I began my closing routine, checking the gym floor for forgotten water bottles, making sure the equipment room was locked. I was just about to lock the gym doors when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a shower turning on in the locker room. I froze, my keys dangling from my hand. Had one of the boys come back? But I had watched every player leave, had said goodbye to each one personally. I stood there for a moment, listening to the steady hiss of water hitting tile, before my sense of responsibility took over. I had to check. The locker room was dim. When I pushed open the heavy door, the fluorescent lights reduced to their night setting, casting everything in a pallid greenish glow. The room was humid, steam beginning to curl above the half wall that separated the changing area from the shower stalls. The sound of running water echoed against the ceramic tiles. I cleared my throat, expecting a response, but there was only the steady drumming of water. When I turned the corner to the shower area, I felt a chill despite the steam that now filled the room. There, standing beneath the third shower head, was a boy, but something was wrong. The water seemed to pass through him rather than cascade over his body. His edges were blurred, like a photograph taken with a shaky hand. He wore shorts and a t-shirt that seemed oddly old-fashioned. His hair was longer than most of my students wore theirs, falling over his ears in a style that reminded me of photos from the 1970s. As I stood there, unable to move, unable to speak, he turned slowly towards me. His face was young, perhaps 15 or 16, but his eyes were wrong, somehow darker than they should be, like endless wells into which one could fall forever. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other, this boy who could not possibly be real, and me, a grown man suddenly reduced to a terrified child. Then, without warning, his image began to waver, like a television losing its signal, and in another instant he was gone. The shower continued to run, but the steam that had filled the room dissipated rapidly. The temperature around me plummeted, my breath suddenly visible in the air. With shaking hands, I turned off the faucet, the squeak unnaturally loud in the silence. I would like to say that I conducted a thorough investigation right then, that I searched the locker room for any explanation, that I behaved with rationality and courage. The truth is, I ran. I drove home well above the speed limit, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. That night, I convinced myself that I had imagined it all, that stress had caused some sort of hallucination. But the next day, I found myself in the school library, during my free period, poring over old yearbooks. It was in the 1976 yearbook that I found him. In the sophomore class photos, Michael Keane, the same boy I had seen in the showers, right down to the slightly too long hair. According to the caption, he had been on the swim team. I checked the next year's annual. Michael Keane was not in the junior class photos. Instead, I found his picture in the memorial section, a full-page tribute. Died tragically, February 12, 1976, it read. I felt sick as I read further, learning that he had died from a head injury sustained during a fight in the boys' locker room. According to the account, he had hit his head on the edge of a shower stall after being pushed by another student. Since that night, I have spoken with other staff members, cautiously at first. The music teacher admitted that she once saw a boy in old-fashioned clothes disappear around a corner in the hallway leading to the gym. The night janitor confessed that he often hears showers turning on and off when he cleans the locker rooms after hours. The previous basketball coach had requested to move practice to the community center one winter, citing mysterious plumbing issues. I still coach basketball at Roosevelt High. I still hold evening practices when necessary, but I never stay alone in the gym after the students leave, and I never enter the locker room alone after dark. Sometimes, during a particularly intense game, when the crowd is roaring and the players are giving everything they have, I catch a glimpse of someone, standing just at the edge of the court, watching. A boy, in outdated clothes with serious eyes. In those moments, I feel a deep sadness rather than fear, as if he is still there, forever 16, forever watching a game he will never again play. Deep down, I know that Michael Keane is still at Roosevelt High, trapped in some endless loop, turning on showers that will never wash away what happened to him on that February day in 1976. The strangest sounds in an empty classroom are the ones that should not exist. The scratch of pencil on paper when no hand guides it. The subtle shift of weight in a chair that holds no body. The soft exhalation of breath from lungs that ceased to draw air years ago. I know these sounds intimately now. They follow me home, persist in my dreams, and linger in the corners of my apartment, where shadows gather at dusk. I was once a woman of logic and reason, a teacher who believed only in what could be measured, tested, and proven. Now I find myself leaving an extra place, sitting at my dinner table for a guest who died half a decade before I ever knew his name. It was an ordinary Tuesday in September when it happened. The air conditioning in my classroom at Millfield High had been acting up all week, leaving the room with a persistent chill that had me keeping my cardigan on despite the lingering summer heat outside. I had been teaching sophomore English for nearly 15 years, so the first day jitters had long ago faded into a comfortable routine: attendance, syllabus review, a get-to-know-you activity, then dive into our first short story. Simple, predictable, safe. The bell rang for third period, and students filtered in with the usual cacophony of teenage chatter and shuffling backpacks. I waited for them to settle, sipping my lukewarm coffee as I observed the new faces that would become familiar over the coming months. 24 students were registered for this class. I knew this because I had counted the roster 3 times that morning, making sure I had enough handouts for everyone. As they took their seats, I noticed a boy in the back row that I did not recall seeing before. He was slight in build with pale skin and dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that partially obscured his eyes. While the other students continued to talk and laugh, he sat perfectly still, hands folded neatly on his desk, an open notebook waiting before him. I made a mental note to check if he was a late addition to my class. Roll call proceeded normally until I reached a name I did not recognize. Looking up from my list, I called out, "Jacob Mercer." There was no response. I repeated the name, scanning the room, and that is when my eyes locked with the quiet boy in the back. His lips curved into a smile that did not quite reach his eyes, but he remained silent. Assuming he was shy, I marked him present and continued with the remainder of class. Throughout the period, I noticed him taking meticulous notes, his pencil moving across the page with a strange fluidity. When I asked questions of the class, his hand never raised, yet his attention never wavered. His focus was absolute, unnerving in its intensity. When the bell rang, signaling the end of the period, the students rushed to pack their things, eager to move on to their next class, all except Jacob. He closed his notebook with deliberate care, tucked his pencil into the spiral binding, and stood with a grace that seemed out of place among the awkward movements of adolescence. As the room emptied, I called out to him, asking him to stay behind for a moment. He turned toward me, that same enigmatic smile on his face, but as a group of students passed between us, he simply disappeared, as if he had never been there at all. Confused, I hurried to the administrative office during my prep period. Mrs. Gonzalez, the school secretary, who had been at Millfield even longer than I had, looked up as I approached her desk. I explained about the new student, describing him in detail, asking about his file. Her brow furrowed as she searched through the computer database. No Jacob Mercer was enrolled in my third period class. In fact, no student by that name was currently registered at Millfield High. Growing increasingly unsettled, I described the boy again, more insistently this time. Mrs. Gonzalez's face drained of color as I spoke, and she abruptly stood, motioning for me to follow her. She led me to a display case in the main hallway, one I had passed countless times without really looking at it. Inside was a memorial plaque, and there, among the faces of students who had died while attending Millfield, was the boy from my classroom. Jacob Mercer had been killed in a car accident 5 years ago, on his way home from school. On a Tuesday, in September, I did not sleep that night, or the night after. I convinced myself it had been a mistake, a trick of light and exhaustion from the start of a new school year. When third period came again, I found myself holding my breath as students filed in, my eyes fixed on the desk in the back row where he had sat. It remained empty throughout the class, and I felt a mixture of relief and lingering unease wash over me. But as the students left at the sound of the bell, I noticed something on that empty desk that had not been there before. A single sheet of paper, torn from a notebook, with neat handwriting covering its surface. I picked it up with trembling fingers and read the words that made my blood run cold. "Thank you for seeing me, Miss Patterson. Most people don't anymore. I will be back tomorrow. I always liked your class the best." He was there the next day, and the day after that, always in the same seat, always taking notes, always smiling that smile that never quite reached his eyes. I never called his name during roll again, but sometimes when I am writing on the board, I can feel his gaze on my back, more intense than any living student's. Sometimes his notebook is open to pages filled with the same sentence written over and over again. "I am still here. I am still here. I am still here." The strangest part is that I have grown accustomed to his presence. I leave an extra handout on his desk each day, and by the end of the period, it is always filled with perfect answers. The other students never seem to notice him, their eyes skipping over his desk as if it were empty. Perhaps it is. Perhaps I am losing my mind, one day at a time, one silent roll call at a time. But I don't think so, because sometimes when the classroom is empty, and the afternoon sun slants through the windows at just the right angle, I can see the faint outline of footprints in the dust motes floating in the air, tracing a path from his desk to mine, and back again. And I know that Jacob Mercer is still attending class, still learning, still trapped in the endless rhythm of school days that will never lead to graduation. And I wonder, with a chill that no amount of sunlight can dispel, what happens to a ghost who finally learns everything his teacher has to offer. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, just me and a few friends from the school faculty. A quiet retreat to an old hotel tucked away in the countryside. They said it was charming, filled with history, and perfect for a break from our hectic lives. But I should have known better than to trust an old building, especially one as mysterious as the Holiday Inn. They called it Holiday for a reason, I suppose, but little did I know, the name was a poor joke. I'm Mrs. Martin, the second-grade teacher at the local elementary school, and I had heard a dozen stories about this place. Teachers from past years would speak about the strange noises and eerie stillness that seemed to hang in the air. But I didn't believe in ghost stories. I was a woman of logic, of reason, or so I thought. I had no interest in superstition. But that night changed everything. When we arrived, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The building itself was beautiful, but its age seemed to ooze from every cracked wall and dusty corner. There was a strange smell, something between mold and the faint, distant aroma of something burning. But I ignored it. It was probably just the weathered stonework and old furniture, I thought. The reception desk was run by an elderly man with pale, glassy eyes. He welcomed us with a hollow smile before handing us our room keys. There was a brief moment when I wondered why he didn't seem to have any other guests, but I brushed it off as nothing more than the oddity of an old hotel. Later that evening, after settling into our rooms, I stepped out into the hallway to stretch my legs. As I walked down the creaky wooden floorboards, I heard faint whispers, so faint I thought they might be coming from the wind outside. But the windows were shut, and I could feel my heart racing, even though I told myself it was just my imagination. I took a deep breath, trying to push the unease aside, but the air felt thick, almost as if something was watching. When I returned to my room, I decided to take a few photographs of the hotel, a hobby of mine. I set my camera up on the windowsill to capture the mist rising from the nearby lake below. As I focused on the view, I thought I saw something moving in the corner of the frame, a shadow, too quick to be a trick of the light. I dismissed it. It was probably nothing, just the way the moonlight caught the branches of the trees outside. But when I snapped the photo, I felt a coldness crawl up my spine. I didn't think much about it at the time, but as I reviewed the photo later, my blood ran cold. There, standing just behind the trees, was a shadowy figure. Its shape was vaguely human, but distorted, like a silhouette, with no distinct features. The figure's presence in the photograph sent a jolt of fear through me. I zoomed in, my heart pounding, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw eyes, a pair of hollow, dark orbs, staring right at me through the trees. I felt the hair on my neck stand on end. Was this just a result of poor lighting, a trick of the camera? I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I shared the photo with a few of my friends, all of whom laughed it off. They thought it was just an overactive imagination or a malfunction with my camera. But as I stood in the lobby, I saw something that made my stomach turn. The elderly receptionist was looking at the photo over my shoulder, his eyes wide, his face went pale, and his lips trembled as he murmured something under his breath. He quickly excused himself and vanished into the back room. I was left with an eerie feeling, something I couldn't explain. As the day passed, strange things began to happen. The air in the hotel grew colder, the lights flickered intermittently, and the faint whispering sounds returned. At night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I decided to leave early the next morning, but before I could pack, something happened that I will never forget. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of something tapping on my door. Soft rhythmic knocks, as though someone was gently asking to come in. My heart raced as I glanced at the clock. 3 a.m. I hesitated, frozen, before slowly approaching the door. I opened it, only to find nothing. No one was there, but the air outside my room felt even colder, and a strange, oppressive silence lingered. I quickly shut the door, locking it behind me, but the feeling of unease refused to leave. I returned to my bed, and just as I was about to drift back to sleep, a cold gust of wind rushed through the room, making the curtains billow. The window had been shut. I sat up, wide-eyed, and saw something I will never forget. The shadowy figure from the photograph, now in the room with me. It was standing by the window, motionless, staring at me with those same hollow eyes. I couldn't scream, couldn't move, paralyzed by terror. The figure seemed to shimmer, its edges becoming more distorted, as if it were barely part of this world. I could hear faint whispers now, surrounding me, coming from everywhere, growing louder and more insistent. The figure's presence was suffocating. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually, the figure faded, as though it were nothing more than a fleeting dream. I didn't sleep a wink the rest of the night, too terrified to close my eyes. When I checked out the next morning, I noticed the receptionist again, his face ashen. He didn't look at me, but as I handed him the key, he whispered, "You weren't supposed to stay here." The words sent a chill through me, and before I could respond, he disappeared into the back room once more. I never spoke of the incident to anyone else, but I shared the photograph with my students a few weeks later. They were intrigued, and some of them even asked if I could go back and take more photos, but I never did. I couldn't bring myself to return to that place. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still see those hollow eyes staring at me from the trees, and I wonder, just for a moment, if the shadow still lingers there, waiting for its next victim. But one thing is certain, whatever was in that photograph, whatever was in that hotel, wasn't human, and it's still out there, watching. The clock on the staff room wall read past midnight. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a dull glow over the empty chairs and scattered lesson plans. The school had long since gone silent, save for the occasional creak of settling wood or the distant hum of a vending machine. I had volunteered for the late shift, covering for a colleague who had called in sick. It was not unusual for me to be here at odd hours, but that night felt different. There was a weight in the air, something unseen pressing down on my chest. Every rustling paper, every slight movement of the walls felt amplified in the stillness of the night. I sat at the desk, flipping through tomorrow's lesson plan, when the phone on the wall rang. The shrill sound sliced through the silence, sending a chill down my spine. No one ever called the staff room this late. I hesitated, staring at the phone as it rang again. With a deep breath, I lifted the receiver and held it to my ear. The line crackled with static, and then a voice came through. My blood ran cold. It was a voice I had not heard in weeks, yet it was unmistakable. Mr. Caldwell had been my colleague for years, a man known for his calm demeanor and methodical teaching. He had passed away 2 weeks ago in a car accident, yet here he was, his voice barely above a whisper, "There is going to be an accident." His words sent a shiver through me. His tone was urgent, almost pleading. The line crackled again, and before I could respond, the call disconnected. I stood frozen, gripping the receiver, as a cold sweat formed on my brow. My heart pounded, my fingers tightening around the receiver until my knuckles turned white. I turned to the door, half expecting to see him standing there. The room was empty, but the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and shift. I could not ignore the warning. My first instinct was to dismiss it as exhaustion playing tricks on me, but something deep inside urged me to act. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. If there was going to be an accident, when would it happen? Where? The silence of the staff room became unbearable, and I decided to leave. My mind raced with possibilities. Could I warn someone? Could I prevent it? I did not know what to do, but the eerie feeling that settled over me told me I had to act fast. I stepped into the hallway, my footsteps echoing through the empty school. The air felt heavy, thick with an unseen presence. As I reached the main doors, my phone vibrated. A news alert popped up. A school bus had skidded off the road on the highway, crashing into a ditch. My breath caught in my throat. That was the same route many of my colleagues took home. I frantically dialed a number, my fingers trembling. The call went to voicemail. The weight in my chest grew heavier. Panic set in. I had dismissed the warning as a trick of my mind, but the evidence was clear. Someone had called me, someone who should not have been able to. And now a tragedy had unfolded just as he had predicted. The next morning, the news spread through the school like wildfire. The accident had claimed 2 lives and left others injured. The staff whispered among themselves, and I sat at my desk, the previous night replaying in my mind. The warning, the voice of a man who should not have been able to speak. I told myself it was a coincidence, but deep down, I knew better. As I gathered my things, my eyes landed on the phone in the corner of the room. It sat there, silent and unassuming, but I could not shake the feeling that it would ring again. And next time, I might not be able to ignore what waited on the other end. Days passed, but the incident refused to leave my mind. Every time I entered the staff room, I hesitated before looking at the phone. I imagined it ringing again, the shrill sound echoing in the silent room. My colleagues tried to move on, chalking the accident up to misfortune, but I could not. I kept thinking back to Mr. Caldwell, his voice full of urgency. Why did he call me? What had he meant by the warning? Had he known more? A part of me wanted to dismiss it as a hallucination, but the sinking feeling in my stomach told me otherwise. One night, unable to shake the unease, I stayed late in the school once more. The staff room was quiet, the only sound my own breathing. I sat by the phone, staring at it as if daring it to ring. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Just as I was about to leave, the air grew colder, a shiver ran down my spine, and then I heard it, a faint whisper. It was not coming from the phone, it was right behind me. I turned around slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The dim lighting cast long shadows on the wall, and for a split second, I thought I saw something move. A figure, just barely out of sight, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. My heart pounded. The school was locked. I was alone, but deep down, I knew I was not. The following morning, I handed in my resignation. I could not explain what I had experienced, but I knew I had to leave. The feeling of being watched, the cold air, the whisper, none of it was normal. As I packed my things, I took one last look at the phone. It sat there, still and quiet, but I knew it would ring again. Perhaps not for me, but for someone else. And when it did, I could only hope they would listen to the warning before it was too late.